Welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. Want to talk about the Bible today. Yep, the Bible, right? World's best-selling book of all time. How about them apples? But how do we know it's actually true? Okay? I mean, if we were raised in Sunday school, we'd probably believe it, but many people think it's just written by humans, okay? And we don't have the original copies, so fair enough, right? Is today's Bible accurate? Is it trustworthy? We're joined today by Dr. Craig Evans. He is a world-renowned Bible scholar. He's often a guest on secular TV networks when dealing with biblical questions. He's a professor at Houston Christian University, a prolific author, over 90 books. That's a lot of books, folks. The book we're promoting today is Jesus and the Manuscripts, and that's available at craigaevans.com. Don't forget to put the A in the middle of there, craigaevans.com. Good to have you with us, Dr. Evans.
Hi, Paul. Good to be with you.
Yeah, it's been a while. I had the privilege of interviewing you many times over the years, and been a while, though, so good to have you back on with us here today. But by the way, I did notice that the documentary film Fragments of Truth is now available to view for free on your YouTube channel. I saw that on X, your Twitter account there. And actually, I sat down with my kids here last week, and we watched it together, and they actually thought it was pretty interesting. So I love it. You know, when kids go and find that interesting and their faith is built up, I'm getting, double thumbs up on that. So good on you there. So, well, is the Bible trustworthy?
Well, of course it is. And these ideas that somehow things got mixed up or the original text is lost and we don't know what it really says anymore. We don't know what the gospel writers really wrote, or even which gospel ought to be in the New Testament. I mean, these kinds of things that are kicked around in the popular media, and this has been going on for decades. It's hokum, it's bogus, but it's not what real biblical scholars say. Biblical scholars will quibble over this and that and matters of interpretation, but the text of the Bible is stable, and that's true for the Old Testament, not just for the New. And there's plenty of archaeological evidence that supports ancient biblical narratives. So we need to be clear about that. And of course, I'm quite happy to review any particular detail you want to bring up.
Okay, well, let's get at it here. First of all, I guess maybe we could start with the Bible being, a collection of books, essentially, right? In one sense, 40 different authors. I think it was about a 1,500-year time period that it was written over. And so for the New Testament books, right, so from Jesus onward, what are the earliest copies, manuscripts that we have in existence?
Oh, they're pretty early. The New Testament writings were probably all written in the second half of the first century. So we're talking about, say, 49, 50 AD to...
These are the originals now, so
these are when they were written,
Yep.
First written. And of course, as soon as they're written, the copies are being made. So the earliest copies are also in this same period of time, the second half of the first century. And so by the time we get into the second century, already there are multiple copies of all of these books that are circulating. But, Paul, one thing a lot of our listeners probably don't know, in antiquity, when someone finished a copy, perhaps there have been 2 or 3 drafts, and then they're finally finished, that one copy isn't then just put in the mail and sent off. There's a retained copy as well. And so you could have multiple copies, and they would all have the authority of autographs, meaning that they're the actual writings that come from the author himself that go out in circulation. And so even if one copy gets lost early on, damaged, destroyed, whatever, there are other copies circulated, which means very rapidly the text as originally written has been multiplied. So if somebody came along 20, 30, 40 years later and didn't like what Matthew said or didn't like something in, say, Paul's letter to the Romans and wanted to change it for some reason, it isn't going to succeed because there are too many other copies of the original already floating around. And it's being translated into Latin in the second century. So there's no way somebody with a novel idea, somebody who wants to portray Jesus differently, and he says, oh, I'll change the Sermon on the Mount, or I'll tell a different story here. Okay, go ahead and try. It's not going to succeed because it'll stick out like a sore thumb because all of the other copies in other places in the Mediterranean world read the way it was originally written. So
Right.
he's
So it's not as
deliberately
easy as it sounds. Yeah.
no, you
Okay.
would not. You and I could get in a time machine, go back in time, and deliberately make alterations. In any of the writings we want. It would not. And
Okay.
then come back to our time, and guess what? The New Testament isn't changed. It's the same.
Hmm. Now, what are the earliest copies that we have in existence that we can actually? I mean, they're in a library somewhere, in a museum somewhere, whatever, right? That you can actually physically look at, or maybe even touch. I know you've looked at them and touched them yourself, right? How far back do we go?
Well, we go back to the second century. The oldest fragment is probably still John chapter 18. This is where Jesus is being interrogated by Pontius Pilate, and Jesus is being accused. This John chapter 18, and it leads to his crucifixion in chapter 19, and his resurrection in chapter 20. So it's a very important passage. It's very small, but it's front side, back side, and so we know it's in a leaf, a page in a codex, and it's dated sometime in the middle of the second century, maybe even earlier. Some have dated as early as about 100, which is probably a
Wow.
little too early. But we have maybe 6, 7, 8 other fragments of the New Testament that are also second century.
Okay.
And that compares rather well with most literatures from the past that are prized, treasured, copied, and studied. In most cases, we're hundreds of years removed from when the original text was written, and we have a copy. But with the New Testament, you get about 200 years away from it, or even less than that, and we have the entire text preserved, and we can go to museums and libraries around the world and look at them. So we're not guessing, we're not imagining. They're there, and as you just said, in Fragments of Truth, the documentary we did a few years ago, we visited and looked at the oldest fragments of the New Testament. They exist, they're real. You can look at them, they're authentic, they're not fakes. And
Hmm.
so the New Testament is very well preserved.
So again, the argument is, well, if you've got this 150-year, 200-year gap between the originals and the actual first, fragments or manuscripts that we have, then there's lots of time for intentional or unintentional errors. So therefore, we can't trust it, right? So, and again, so part of the argument against that, as you just made, is that, well, no, there were multiple copies made and in different languages, so we can kind of compare those. I guess one of the things you brought out, I know in that documentary was quite interesting, is that, okay, now the early manuscripts I understand were written on papyrus, okay, and then, so how long would those original copies last? I think we think in our mind, well, papyrus, I mean, it's kind of like, it's kind of like weak paper sort of thing. It's not going to last very long, right? But you're saying those actually remained in circulation for quite some time.
Yeah, they did. And it's important to know that if a book is cared for, a book made of papyrus, and that's a type of reed that used to grow in abundance, not so much now, but in antiquity in the Nile River in Egypt. And so the ancients would slice up the reeds into strips and put the strips together like my fingers,
Hmm.
going one way, and then a layer of strips going horizontally over the vertical strips, press two boards against it, give it a day or two to dry out, and then you had a sheet of paper. They'd trim it, they'd sew these or glue these pages together, make a book roll or a scroll, or later just sew the pages, stack them up, and make what we call a codex or a book that looks a lot like a modern book. Well, we have papyrus paper like this is 3,000 years old.
That's
Well,
incredible.
yeah, the
3,000 years
oldest
old. That's
Testament
nuts.
writing. Yeah, it's
Wow.
only the oldest New Testament writing today wouldn't even be 2,000 years old. And so papyrus obviously lasts a long time. And we have papyrus that was simply thrown out as trash outside, covered with sand, therefore not cared for at all, not protected in the least. And it's still intact and we can read it. And,
Wow.
and some of this papyrus, goes back to 100, even 200 BC, thrown outside, not necessarily used as stuffing in a mummy that's in a tomb, which is better protected.
Hmm.
Parchment, which is a prepared, thinly stretched out leather animal skin, Parchment is even more durable and lasts a long, long time. And so the idea that the originals could last a few hundred years, that's not preposterous in the least. We have books that are 16, 1700 years old that were not kept in air conditioned, protected, climate protected chambers. They are now, but they weren't throughout the Middle Ages. Yet there they are. They're in perfect condition. You can flip the pages, you can read the text. And so, we have papyrus books too that are 1,500 years old, and only in the last 100 years have they been well protected. So the idea of originals written in the first century lasting on into the third and fourth, even fifth centuries is not ridiculous. What happened to the autographs is the Roman authority deliberately destroyed them.
Oh, really?
Christians would put them on display. We know this because they say so. They talk about that. And they were even then seen as almost like precursors to holy relics. This is from Paul's hand. He wrote this. This is Matthew. John wrote this. One bishop says the original of John is on display in Ephesus. When he says this, it's in the 290s, which would make the original of John 200 years old. Yeah, so we're not guessing. We have actual statements. Tertullian, toward the end of the second century, about 190, in one of his writings, he says, Paul's letters, you can check them. The heretics misrepresent them. You go look at the originals. They're here, they're there, they're there.
Wow.
And he identifies 8 of Paul's letters that are still in existence. Well, Paul's letters would have only been 125, 130 years old by that point. That's not very old.
And these are the originals. So again, so that means if anybody's trying to, and they're accessible, so how would you make any kind of forgeries? I mean, it's obviously you're able to check it against that, and so it's a pretty good system there that I'm assuming God put there. Hey, He's going to watch over His word, right? So,
and Paul, this is not unique to Christian writers. This isn't some kind of theological thing that I'm talking about.
Okay.
Galen, the medical examiner, researcher, well known from the second century, he brags about having 300-year-old books.
Wow.
There are people talking about having the actual autographs of Aristotle at a time when they would be 300 years old. These are from secular writers or pagan writers writing in Greek and Latin. And so the idea of a scroll that's 200, 300 years old, that's no big deal. If you take care of them, they don't have to be in dry, arid Egypt to last a long time. They can be in damp, humid Europe for 15 centuries or more and still be in perfectly good shape.
Yeah, that's actually quite astonishing to me. Of course, as evangelical Christians, we believe that the Bible is inerrant. And yet when we look at some of these ancient manuscripts that we're talking about here, we see that there are things like spelling errors, right? And sometimes missing verses, that sort of thing. So can you unpack that for us a bit here? That maybe casts doubt on the veracity, the authority of the Bible.
Yeah, there's confusion there. People get into the inerrancy thing and, there's not one word wrong or something like that. And they're really misdefining it. What the ancients talked about is that God's truth was without error preserved in these scriptures. Mm-hmm. They knew perfectly well when copies were made. This is true of the Hebrew Bible. Scribes would make mistakes, but not all scribes made the same mistakes. And when you have multiple copies and you can compare, say you have 20 copies of Matthew, and scribe number 13 made a mistake, left an entire line out, or perhaps wrote the same line twice. Well, the other scribes didn't do that. And so when we compare them, it's obvious, he made a mistake, and that's no big deal. And by the way, we count as mistakes corrections also. And so a scribe may, he leaves a word out, he proofreads, he sees that. And so in the margin off to the side, he writes in the word he accidentally left out. We still cite that as a quote error or a variant, even though, no, it's not an error. It is a proper correction. He's proofreading. They didn't have keyboards the way we do. They didn't have computers. They didn't have whiteout. And if they made a mistake, they corrected it. So we're counting everything, and it creates this impression that, oh my goodness, the manuscripts are full of mistakes. Not really.
Okay, that's people need to hear that. Very, very good. All right, if you're just joining us right now, speaking with Dr. Craig Evans. Again, he's with Houston Christian University. He's the author of a book called Jesus and the Manuscripts and about 89 other books, by the way. So CraigAEvans.com is where you can get a hold of a copy. And again, these are things are worth reading. Again, the documentary film Fragments of Truth available at Dr. Evans's YouTube channel, worth checking out. It'll build your faith and just to give you a good picture of how this all came together. And speaking of how this all came together, often we hear the question, well, how do we determine which books, should be included in the New Testament, right? Who determined it and how? And some argue that it was Roman Emperor Constantine back in, I think it was 325, the Council of Nicaea. So what's the truth there?
Well, it certainly isn't what Dan Brown said in Da Vinci Code. Come on, it's pretty silly.
Mm-hmm.
He gets most of everything wrong in that. He's a halfway decent writer, but his research was way off the tracks on that. Constantine didn't settle the contents of canon. He wanted Christian leaders, bishops, and teachers to get together and get on the same page and say, this is the doctrine of Christ. This is what we as Christians believe. And I think that was good that Constantine did that. There was no internet back then. There were no Zooms. Nobody could do conference calls. We need to all get together and talk through, because some people are teaching something that's getting a little bit too far this direction and others too far that direction. So it was mostly focused on what we call Christology. So in what sense was Jesus divine? In what sense was he human? What do we say about that in light of the triune Godhead? That sort of thing. And that was the important thing. But when Dan Brown's book, Da Vinci Code, says, and I'm trying to quote it, it's a terrible quotation, that Sir Lee Teabing, a lead character in the novel, says that Emperor Constantine collated the New Testament. That's pure baloney.
Right.
Whatever that even means, collate the New Testament. He didn't choose the books. It erroneously claims there were 85 Gospels, and that Constantine chose 4 of them, the ones that show Jesus as divine. That he actually has it backwards. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John emphasize the incarnation, the humanness of Jesus, whereas most of these other Gospels, and there weren't 85, there were maybe 3 dozen, so he exaggerates the number. But these other Gospels, many of them are Gnosticizing or Gnostic. They deny the humanity. It's all about the divinity. It's all about the heavenliness of Jesus.
Which goes, of course, against Scripture. It often talks about, denying that Jesus came in the flesh. That's like an antichrist spirit, right?
Yeah. So, like I said, Dan Brown in his Da Vinci Code book just has it upside down and backwards.
Okay.
Unfortunately, 50 plus million copies of the book sold.
Yeah. But you know what? On the bright side, there's a whole lot more Bibles out there. So.
Oh my goodness, yeah. And they think maybe 100 million people read it.
Yeah.
Millions more watched the movie version in 2006, starring Tom Hanks, as critics said, looking confused and bored for 2 hours. I saw the movie. I read the book. It is so full of baloney. It's really sad.
Well, so what is the truth then, as far as how it was put together? I mean, there were different bishops, etc., right? Christian leaders that were at this council here. So what were the, I guess, qualifiers as to which books should be included, which ones should not? How did they decide that?
Well, the canon, in a day-to-day sort of way, a very pedestrian, down-to-earth sort of way, had been pretty well settled in the 2nd century.
So before this was officially made, this was already kind of the general Christian population already knew which ones were.
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, otherwise we can't make any sense of what Irenaeus is doing. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, France, in the year 180 or so, brings out a work that's called Against All Heresies. And so he argues for the 4 Gospels, not as a new idea. He's defending it. So it's an idea that's already in place. he's pushing back against those who want to expand that number and include additional gospels. And he's very critical of them, and he's very accurate in his discussions. He includes, criticizing the so-called Gospel of Judas, which we talked about 20 years ago when a copy of that was found and restored and published by National Geographic. So he knew what he was talking about, but the way he argues is everybody knows it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and that's it.
Well, very interesting.
Yeah, and that's the year 180. That's 145 years before the Council of Nicaea.
That's a good chunk of time there.
Yeah. And so he's not trying to say, look, I know everybody thinks it's 7 or 8. I recommend 4. The argument for 4 is set. It's recognized.
So maybe it wasn't as difficult of a choice at that time as we think it was. And now, again, I'm assuming they probably had some categories as if, we're going to include writers that, actually encountered Jesus in person, that sort of thing, like the apostles. What kind of categories did they have there, qualifiers?
Well, see, the canonical materials, most of the writings of the New Testament were written when most of the eyewitnesses were still living, or a significant number were.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when the Gospels are written, they're tapping into material that's been circulating among Jesus's followers since the days of Jesus's ministry. So you have a continuity. For somebody to introduce a parable or a strange teaching that Jesus never taught would stick out like a sore thumb. Nobody could get away with that. So when Mark wrote, we think he was the first narrative gospel to write. Matthew and Luke follow the Markan narrative, but then augment it with these teachings that go back to Jesus and his apostles. And so they end up with their larger gospels that we call Matthew and Luke. Well, this stuff is all connected to the first generation. So that it's just no way you could get some alien brand new ideas thrown in. So these were immediately recognized. There wasn't any competition. It isn't until you get into the second century. Now you're talking about really a third generation, and you get some ideas, some people saying, I'd like Jesus to say a few other things. I've got this idea of, and what we now call cults. And so somebody is coming up with a new idea. They like this philosophy over here that's pagan. So let's restate the Jesus story that way. And then that's when the pushback begins. No, we already have these 4. They're right. They're apostolic. They go back to Jesus. This new stuff, shoot, the ink isn't even dry on the paper yet. And it's got new ideas that do not go back. And so they knew that. And so the canon question was really sorted out church by church, leader by leader, long before councils formally ratified anything.
So then they ratified this, and if there were any kind of efforts to get in a book that didn't line up with the, again, 4 original gospels there, again, the deity of Christ, that sort of thing, and of course his humanity as well. Those kinds of things had to be consistent. You're not going to get something that's inconsistent included in there, basically, right?
Well, sure. The creedal statements, Paul is quoting a creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that probably was in circulation the very first year of the life of the church.
Wow. Okay.
And if somebody's going to come along as Gnostics and others in the 2nd century, 3rd century did, and say that, Jesus didn't die on the cross. A guy named Basilides was saying that in the middle of the 2nd century. Well, that's laughable, and everybody knew that, and they'd push back. So the idea that there were these goofy ideas at the beginning, and someone later arbitrarily chose which ideas would become orthodox, that's a fiction. That is not what happened.
Let me ask you a quick question here on archaeology. I know you've done a fair bit of archaeological work yourself. You've been there and seen some of these things firsthand. How important is that to verifying the authenticity of the Bible? What do we have in archaeology that kind of jumps out?
Oh yeah, there are a lot of things. Under the general heading of verisimilitude, I know it sounds technical, but it's a great word. Historians and archaeologists always use it. Verisimilitude. It means that the written source that we're looking at, in this case, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts, we could add, exhibits verisimilitude. In other words, what they're talking about can be confirmed through archaeological work and other historical research. So in other words, another simple way of putting it, is that the 4 New Testament Gospels and the book of Acts talk about real people, real places, real events. How do we know that? Archaeology finds the places. There are traces of the events, traces of the people. Then you look at other historians like Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and so on. They're talking about the same people too, without any reference to the New Testament. And so you have independent witnesses all talking about the same people, same places, same events, and you get this coherence and this agreement. And so the extra canonical, the later second, third century Gospels, they miss the mark. They're talking about people that there's no evidence they ever existed. They're talking about places that don't exist, or they get things bungled up and they misunderstand where they decide to depart from the New Testament Gospels and add some extra stuff. That's almost always where they go wrong. So this is why archaeologists today, and Paul, you could volunteer, and I encourage you to do that, to dig for 2 weeks for no pay, sweat in the sun as a volunteer digger. I've done that at sites in Israel, and the archaeologist might be Jewish, he might be agnostic, and yet he's reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, book of Acts, and you say, I don't understand it. You're not a Christian. Why are you reading those? Because they're accurate, they're reliable. I rely on them. I know where to dig. I understand what I have found when I dig
That's
it up.
incredible. And I'm looking at the clock here. I'm running out of time. Got to leave it there. But that's a good place to leave it. You're right. They do use it because it's accurate. So there's something to be said there. Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Craig Evans. Again, his website, drcraigaevans.com, and the book is called Jesus and the Manuscripts. I highly recommend you read some of these books or check out, again, his Fragments of Truth documentary on his YouTube channel, all right? So God bless you, Craig, and thank you so much for watching, everyone. Appreciate it. Again, WizeUp.ca. Share this with your friends. Love to hear from you. God bless.